Right, we're on the hour, so I think let's get ourselves started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Rising. I'll be your moderator today in Room 2, Security and Compliance. Let's get straight into the good stuff. It's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Thijs Lecomte, and Thijs is going to be talking to us this morning about security in Microsoft Teams looking beyond. So Thijs, over to you. Take it away whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you very much, Peter. So security in Microsoft Teams is a big topic, and throughout this day we'll see sessions mostly focused probably on the configurations you can do within Teams. But the goal of this session is to show you, okay, the entire Microsoft ecosystem is interconnected, and if you're going to be securing Microsoft Teams, you also need to look beyond what is inside of the Microsoft configuration portal. So I'm going to be talking about what is beyond Teams and what should you be going to for Azure AD, Microsoft Information Protection, anti-spam, these kind of things. So it's going to be more of a overview session of things I recommend you to configure with some practical tips and tricks in between, and not a deep dive into one specific product. So the goal is for you to know, okay, what is out there, what is inside of a Microsoft ecosystem, and from my experience, what have I seen and what do I recommend? So first, a little introduction of myself. So as Peter said, I'm Thijs Lecomte, I'm from Belgium, and I'm a Microsoft 365 consultant working for The Collective, which is a Microsoft MSSP, focusing on delivering security services and products to our customers. Within my role in The Collective, I'm also the lead of our internal SOC, so our Managed Detection and Response service, where we provide a security service to our customers. And from that experience, I learn a lot every day, which I can share with you today. So I'm available on social media, of course, on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And I also have a blog, 365 by Thijs, where I'll blog about security, endpoint management, and automation. And then I'm also the technical editor for the Microsoft 365 Security for the IT Pro book, which is a really long name, but it's essentially an ebook with monthly updates, which covers the entire Microsoft 365 security products, all of the products in that. And we have monthly updates so that if you ever need to know what's new from previous months, you just open the book and see what updates we have published. Apologies for that. So to introduce, I want to kind of set the scene and talk into, okay, what the different stages of what an attack could look like. If you're going to be defending your environment, you need to be able to know where you're going to be defending it from. So this next slide is a little bit chaotic. It's a lot of information into one slide, but we'll walk through it one by one to show you what the components are. So this is an example of an attack. It's not complete, but it goes to show you what the different stages are. So at the top, we can see we have the reconnaissance stage, which is the first one. So an attacker will try to see and peek into the environment, into your company, and look for specific information and look for specific attack vectors. Or you may be vulnerable to Log4j. Do you have some kind of password saved into a public Git repo? These kind of things will be scanned. And that's always the first part. So defending against what is publicly available maybe, and trying to avoid that you overly share sensitive information. From there will be an initial access phase, which means the first contact with the company. And mostly this is through an end user, which could be through a phishing email, through malicious documents, or through a website where they're trying to get into to have an additional foothold in your company. Of course, it's important that it's not only your own company you have to be aware and protect, there's also third parties, of course. And it's a great example these past few days because we've seen the breach of Okta and the potential breach of Microsoft, which are both, of course, really big cloud companies. So you have to be aware of which products you use, if it's SaaS, if it's just a product installed on your server, to make sure that you monitor that as well. If they are breached, that you're also protecting your environment from that. And then we go into the initial access phase, so having a phishing link, a malicious email, a website being breached due to vulnerability. And then we get to the payload delivery. So after initial access is made, they will try to get a foothold into the environment. This means some malicious content will run and will be exploited. This means that a device will be exploited and will be compromised. So they will have a foothold on the device and they will try to compromise that device to have as much visibility on that device as possible. If they were able to install their software, they will try to phone home. They will try to go to a command and control server to say, hey, this is me. This is my IP address. I've reached this customer. What should I do? What are my next steps? Give me some input. Give me commands. And based on the commands from the command and control server, they will try to move further into the environment, deeper into the environment. If they breach a regular account, okay, a regular account is great, but they probably want to go further into a sensitive account or the account of a CEO or domain admin. So we'll do discovery, looking what's out there, what do we have right now, and then also escalation, privilege escalation, trying to get into a different account, a domain admin, something like that. And if they have breached the entire environment, if they got to domain admin, to global admin, you have two choices, whatever they want to do, because they have complete control. They can execute a ransomware attack, of course, and make sure that every file in your organization is encrypted, where you have to pay a ransomware fee to them in order to get the decryption key. Or what's more and more apparent these past few years is that, of course, ransomware, you can just restore a backup, but they also say, okay, if you're not going to pay the ransom, we're going to leak some of the sensitive data, which can be really, really dangerous if you go, for example, if you're Microsoft or Okta, and they're going to be releasing source code. So these are different stages of attacks. And this is pretty generic, I know, but it's just to show you an overview of what is involved in an attack and what should you be aware of. And it's just important to know that security is not one thing to do. It's not enabling MFA. We know we talk a lot about MFA. MFA is great, but it's not something that if you fix MFA, everything is done. So you need to be aware of, okay, I have to execute different steps and have to have as much layers as possible. So compare it like a labyrinth. The harder it is to go inside of the labyrinth, the harder it is for an attacker to get in. Because most attackers are also lazy. If they can't breach initially with some simple attacks, most likely if you're not targeted, they will stop. So going to the next slide. This is a typical Microsoft marketing slide, I know, but it does provide a nice example of this multi-layer security approach, where we're not only focusing on one layer, for example, identities with MFA, but you have to be aware of all of the different layers within your environment. Of course, within the Microsoft stack, which we're using right now, you have the different Microsoft products combined. You have, for example, Azure for infrastructure, Azure AD for identities. But of course, this is generic. This could be Okta for identities, for example. But it's just to confirm, okay, we have the different layers, different products, and you have to be aware of each layer. And most of these layers will also come back during the presentation to talk about, okay, how can you protect one of those layers and how can you make sure that they work together and the protections are combined. At the top, I also threw zero trust in there. Another pretty big buzzword, and while there's lots of misconceptions about zero trust, and I'm not going to say it's the ideal solution to protect your environment, far from it, but it is a nice approach to say, okay, we're going to be moving away from a typical perimeter security on the firewall, and we're going to take it to the endpoint and the firewall and the data and the infrastructure, and having that layered approach to make sure you have lots of stops before an attacker gets in. So this is about this presentation is about looking beyond Microsoft Teams security. The first slide I will show you is about, okay, what can we configure in Teams? And afterwards, I will go into the different steps outside of Teams. So first of all, looking into what can we do within Teams, and that's mostly talking about, okay, what can we do within the Teams console. If you go to admin.teams.microsoft.com, there's lots of options out there. Mostly they're for productivity, they're for team-specific configurations, but there are a few things that from a security standpoint you should be aware of. The first one might be debatable. It's Teams creations. By default, everybody can create a team, which means everybody can be owner of a team. Then they can remove the team, remove the data, invite guests. So we need to be aware of, okay, who can create team. I'm a fan of having everybody the ability to create a team, but you just have to create user awareness on what it means to create a team and what responsibilities they have. Because, for example, a team owner to create a team can invite guests. Guest access is, of course, a really big thing in Teams. You can easily collaborate, share files, chat. It's so easy to go in between. But for example, a default configuration Azure AD is if you have an existing guest, they can invite another guest and another, and another. But that's something you probably don't want because you need to be in control of guest access. A user can maybe invite a guest themselves, but only that guest. If that user wants to invite his colleague, he needs to go back to the original employee and ask for the invitation. And guest access is something that's not mostly managed, and I could talk an entire session about guests. You just need to be aware of the process, who is within your environment, what needs to be done to approve it, and have lifecycle management for that. Besides that, we have app permissions, and maybe it's easier if I show this into the portal. So I will slide over the Teams portal. So we're in Teams Admin Center, admin.teams.microsoft.com. And if we go to Teams apps, we can have an ID of which apps are available within the environment. So each of those 1,464 apps are available within every environment of Teams. This can be great because it's easy collaboration. It's really easy to just add something, implement a SaaS product and start using it, start integrating it. And I'm not a fan of locking it down entirely, but you just have to be aware of what is possible, because some of these apps might be one. If you have a third-party breach, for example, Okta or Microsoft or Teddy Berry is breached, who knows? You need to be aware of you have Teddy Berry in use, and you should be maybe blocking it or mitigating it. And of course, all of these apps also provide an example of data exfiltration. You can easily add Dropbox as an app and move all of the files from your Teams to Dropbox, which could be great if you're using Dropbox for business, but if you're not, this could be data exfiltration. So what can we do? Well, you can disable it or block it entirely, or what you can also create are some permission policies. So we have one permission policy here in this test tenant, and here we can say which apps are available. And we can say, for example, okay, third-party applications, all of the apps are available, but block some others, blacklist, or block specific apps and allow some other, whitelist. And it's just important that you should be aware of these settings and have a strategy on what you're going to be doing. I'm not saying block everything, because Teams is a collaboration process and it's easier to combine them, but just be aware of the dangers behind this. And then lastly, we have meeting policies. It's something smaller, of course, but meeting policies will define who can present, who can get into the meeting without a lobby. Like you guys here, Peter disabled all of the cameras and mics just to avoid some disruption. But it's important to go over these settings. I recently onboarded a highly classified environment into Microsoft Teams. And I think we spent 2 days just going over the entire Microsoft Teams portal and checking every setting out there. And that's really specific to that organization, of course, just because they're that highly classified. But it's important that you need to be aware of every control you have within Teams. So this is talking about, okay, what's in Microsoft security. Of course, this session is looking beyond, so I'll pivot to that. So first of all, we have admins and access. RBAC is a pretty big thing. Who can access what and what admin privileges do they have? And if you look at this flow, this goes from least privilege to high privilege. And of course, you should be looking into assigning least privilege permissions instead of high privilege permissions. and you should be going to the left as much as possible, and there should be a 0 somewhere which just says regular user or a member. Because it's important, the team owner is also some kind of an admin. He has complete control over a team. He can invite guests, remove users, add new applications, add new tabs, add new channels, delete a channel, delete a team. This can have a pretty big impact, and it's important that they should be aware of who are the team's owners and what they can do. Then, of course, we go from into the admin roles within Azure AD. And I don't know if many people know this, but for Microsoft Teams specifically, there are 5 different RBAC roles within Azure AD. So we have, for example, Teams admin, which can have the whole Teams administrator, but we also have Teams device administrator, which can only manage a Teams meeting rooms, for example. Just be aware of these things happening, and these things are possible. And then we go further, of course, in a specific role like security administrator, Intune administrator, user access administrator, and then to global admin. Global admin is a pretty big role, and most companies, certainly sub 500, will always assign global admin just because it's the easiest thing to do. But it's also so dangerous because a global admin can have complete control of an environment and can essentially just disable the entire mail flow and collaboration of an organization. So just being aware of the impacts of a global admin is extremely important. And that's also where another product comes in from the Microsoft security stack, which is privileged identity management. And with PIM, we don't assign roles. Assigned, you don't always have that role, but you have to request it with an automatic approval. Why am I saying this? Well, because it's easy. For example, I and organizations have 4 different roles assigned to me. I have Intune admin, security admin, user access administrator, and global admin. And when I'm starting my work, when I have to execute an admin task, I think, okay, what's the least privileged way to do this? And I try to avoid activating global admin. And with PIM, it's an easy way to say, okay, I have the least privileged roles available, but when I need the global admin, I can activate it, but maybe there's some monitoring or alerting behind that. So this slide is to say, lots of options out there. Don't go immediately to point 4, but try to move up as much as possible and try to assign the roles in Azure AD as granular as possible. Moving on to identity, this is a slide I just stole from Microsoft. You probably recognize this. With access control and Azure AD, how is this done? Well, by default, anybody can access an Azure AD environment from any place, from any device, at any time. That sounds great from a productivity standpoint. But I have seen customers these last few weeks being really scared due to the geopolitical reasons happening right now with Russia and Ukraine, and saying, okay, but why would my user want to log in from Russia or the Ukraine? I want to block that. And that's maybe not the best solution to block countries, but it's just important to know that by default, anybody can access an Azure AD environment. And that's why we have conditional access. And with conditional access, we can set up certain permissions, certain restrictions onto if a user can access the environment based on certain conditions. And also, if he can access it, are there any additional requirements like an MFA prompt needed? If we look into this for Teams, I always recommend a few specific conditional access policies. These are 4 I wrote down right now. We're going to pivot to the portal in just a bit. It's not that these 4 are the end-all be-all solution, not at all, but it's just an easy starting point to get going. So top 2 are maybe pretty generic. It requires an MFA. MFA should be enabled, no questions asked, users and admins. And then the second one, legacy authentication. If you don't know, I hope you know, legacy authentication is being blocked this year, I think, by Microsoft on Exchange Online. And with my time in our SOC, if you disable legacy authentication, you'll see such a big decrease in password spray attacks and in breached accounts. Most of the attacks currently are being done using legacy authentication. And if you disable legacy authentication, you will be mitigating about 70–80% of the attacks. And these are pretty simple conditional access policies, of course. So I'll pivot to the portal. If you go to Azure AD into conditional access, you see I have a few policies here. The block legacy authentication one is pretty simple. You should know it by now. It's just within client tabs, select all of the legacy authentication clients and choose block access. That's a really easy one. We have blocked access for legacy authentication. One thing I want to point out is MFA for admins. Is of course you need to be requiring multi-factor authentication as a grant permission. It's important for admins. I always do it without the condition because an admin should be used to getting MFA prompts and knowing how to handle them. But one important thing is within the assignment. As you can see, we have the option to select users and groups, but also options to select directory roles. And you might say, okay, let's just select all of the directory roles I see in there and let's assign them. There are a few downsides here. One of them, this is for an active assignment. If you're using PIM and you have a role assigned, say global admin, but you haven't activated it yet, you don't require MFA. And I do prefer a requirement of MFA on a sign-in, even if I don't have a role active. And also, as you can see, this is a manual select of every role available. If Microsoft brings out new roles, you have to be aware to enable these roles specifically. And there's also built-in roles, but also custom roles. So you should be aware if somebody creates a custom role, oh, I should think about adding it to the conditional access policy to make sure that admin does MFA. For me, that's impossible to do. So what I mostly recommend is having a group of users. And this could be a dynamic group, looking for all of the admin users within your environment and making sure that you assign the policy that will just avoid that you have somebody using a specific role, which is not applicable within the conditional access policy to require MFA. And then the bottom two might be not that apparent and not that known, but it's something I really, really do recommend. One of it is MFA configuration. So anybody from any place can update their authentication methods. They can go into the myaccounts.microsoft.com and update the policy, add a Microsoft Authenticator app or disable one or remove one. This can also be done from any place at any time if you're logging correctly. I do recommend ensuring that a MFA configuration can only be done from a company device, like a compliant or hybrid joint device, but having an exclusion out there for your trusted locations. This means if they have a compliant device, great, they can do it on the device. If they don't have a compliant device, they need to go into the office and configure it there. This will just avoid that anybody can update the MFA configurations, which is pretty dangerous. Also, because if a user never did MFA, the first time he needs to do MFA, he will be prompted to fill in the configurations. And you want to protect that part to make sure that the initial configuration is always done from a trusted location or a trusted place. And then besides that, point for compliant devices for apps, I told you that Azure AD is open by default, and that might be great, but it also means that anybody can open Teams on their personal device, have it cached, go into OneDrive, open up their OneDrive, sync something, and have it all downloaded, which can have a pretty big security impact. So I like to say that for compliant, data, company data, if you're going to be using an app, you should be using a compliant device. Or if you're using a personal device, you have access to the browser, but you are restricted on what you can do and you cannot download anything into your session. So moving on from identity to data. Data is protected in Microsoft by Microsoft Information Protection. What is Microsoft Information Protection? Well, it's just something generic to you identify, is this data sensitive, and then you protect it. You label it, you assign it, this is sensitive, and this will ensure that there's specific configurations to do. This is an entire session on its own. Microsoft Information Protection is so huge. But what I do want to point out is that if we go into the compliance center where it is configured, information protection is of course here, and then we can create labels. I have created a label here, but it's important that if you look into the scope, a label can be assigned to a file, an email, or a group. And of course, a group is also a Microsoft team. So this means we can create a label specifically assigned to a team. And this will not protect the content, the documents inside of that team, but this will add additional restrictions on what is possible. So if you look into this configuration, we can assign this label to groups and sites. And if we go to the groups and site configuration, we have a few options. One of them is, can this team be public or private? Can anybody join? That's one thing. But also, is external access allowed? Because by default, you might have some teams like, hey, let's have a customer coming in there and collaborate. But for some, for example, the management team, you might say, no, let's block guest access. Guest access shouldn't be enabled here. So this is so easy to have a granular approach on these teams have additional restrictions, these teams do not. And the same goes for external sharing and using unconditional access. I talked about restricting web access within the browser. Well, here you can limit it granularly. You can say, okay, by default, every team is open to the internet and anybody can download files. This could be great for just the generic SharePoint or the HR SharePoint. But for specific team, for projects, we want to block access from personal devices. And this goes to show you can granularly configure access based on the team which is being accessed. And this is an extremely powerful configurations. It's a bit hidden away, most people know about it, but I do recommend looking into it just because it provides you the possibility to say, this team is open, this team is closed, this team doesn't have a guest access. It's all configurable. Besides protecting data, of course, what's often unknown is phishing attacks within teams. I showed you in the first slide that we have phishing attacks. Most people have been protecting for phishing attacks and email since day one that the mail server was invented. But are you protecting that somebody can send a malicious email to an end user, which also asks for credentials? Are you monitoring what URLs are being sent? Are you monitoring what companies the users are communicating with? Are you checking which URLs are clicked? It's really important to be aware that phishing attacks and teams will be becoming more and more apparent. And by default, anybody can communicate with any team out there. So it's important that you know about it and you have mitigations in place. What are the potential mitigations? Well, first of all, user awareness, and that's where it starts. A user should be aware of, okay, anybody can contact me, and I should handle my Teams client as my Outlook client. If I see anything specific I don't expect, if I suddenly receive a message from somebody I have never seen and there's a link in there, well, don't click it. A user should be aware of the dangers within Teams. What we also have is we have safe links. So safe links is a part of Microsoft Defender for Office 365, Office ATP, and the old name. And this will rewrite URLs and protect URLs. So if you know it from an email, you will see the email isn't the original URL, but it's rewritten. And if you click on it, it will be scanned at that click and see if it's malicious or not. What's also really convenient is besides scanning, it will also click every user. It will track if a user clicked on the URL. So if you have a URL which is malicious but wasn't recognized on Microsoft Defender, you can go back into time and say, I want to find out who clicked on that specific URL. And then you can see and validate what has happened. So Teams safe links as a part of the regular safe links policy within the security portal. But it's important to be aware that it's configured separately. And of course, unfortunately, it is part of an E5 license. So it needs to be purchased separately, but I just want to show you where it is. If we go into the security portal, We go to email and collaboration. We click on policies and rules. We go to thread policies. Here we have the save links policies. If we click on the save links policies, I have a default out there that wants to load, and that default is configured for Teams. So let me just open it. And here we can see act on any or potentially malicious URLs within Teams. So this will check if a team is malicious or not, if a URL is malicious or not, and will be checked. So it's just really important to be aware of, okay, what is happening, which URLs are there, and mitigate and scan them. And a great question just jumped into chat. Is there a way to remove a malicious link from a user's Teams client? I'm not actually sure. I don't know, Peter, you might be the person to answer this, but can eDiscovery remove Teams messages? That's the only thing I can think of, eDiscovery to look into the inbox and delete the message. But otherwise, I don't think there's any other control. Besides Teams save links, we also have federation. So by default, as I say, anybody can communicate with anybody on the internet. You all can message me on my company Teams, and I will receive the message. And I like this because it allows for easy collaboration, but it is something to be aware of. You can also configure this to say, I have a whitelist, I only let these domains contact me, or I have a blacklist, I will block these malicious domains. Personally, not a fan of restricting, because you also don't restrict email. Anybody can send you email because you need to collaborate with them. I like to avoid limiting federation, but more looking into, okay, how can we try to mitigate it through user awareness and through Teams save links. If you have configured this all, you'll have lots of security configurations out there. What I find really important is the need for auditing. It's just important that everything in Office 365 is logged, every action is logged, and the logs are out there. So you have logs for Sentinel, logs for Azure AD, SharePoint, Teams, every action is logged. And it's just important that you should be aware of what's happening, and these logs are out there. And you should be monitoring those logs. So if we dive into the portal once again, I will just quickly show you where the logs are available. If we go into the security portal again, we can go to audit, and here we have the activities. And if Microsoft wants to load this page for me, you have the different categories for the activities, and you have categories for Teams messages, for deleting Teams tabs. So let me just quickly show you. So much is logged here. You can create team, add a channel. There's things for adding a bot, adding a connector, updating a tab. Everything is logged. It's really important to know that it's in there and it is available. Of course, this is a manual action, and this isn't really intuitive to go into this too much. What we can also do, as you saw on the slide, Microsoft Sentinel is the SIM from Microsoft. I'm really a big fan of Microsoft Sentinel, but we can also ingest all that data from Teams into Microsoft Sentinel, and the SIM have it all in there, and then audit what's happening and create some alerts and incidents. So what we can do is, if we go into Microsoft Sentinel, we can go to our Microsoft Sentinel workspace. And first of all, this is the overview of what's happening within the environment. What is important is you have data connectors, which gets data into Sentinel. If we look into Office 365, we can have lots of data types available. So we have Teams, SharePoint, and Exchange here at the bottom right. So this means we can get data from Teams into Sentinel. And from there, we can create analytic rules. And these are constantly run, constantly checking the environment to see if any hits are found for a query. And I have a few rules in there. So going to Teams Nations. So we, for example, have a rule which say, okay, if there are multiple teams deleted by one user in a short time span, we will create an incident, and this incident should be investigated. Or if a malicious URL, a malicious login happens, and after that something specific happened in Teams, we should be creating an incident. This goes to show, okay, it's Sentinel right now. It's again from Microsoft, but this can happen in Splunk and in other SIM products or other monitoring products. But it's just really important to be aware that if you're configuring the security products, it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop afterwards. You should be aware of, okay, what can we do? What can we configure? And what is happening within the environment? What are the users doing? And should we be monitoring for anomalies within the users' activities to make sure that nobody is breached? Because if you have somebody who says, okay, I implemented security products, we're safe, that isn't the case. I have seen customers who implemented every security product out there, an EDR, an antivirus, an anti-spam, the entire Microsoft Defender stack, but they had a breach and their environment was breached, but it was alerted. There was an incident about it, but they just didn't respond to it. So this brings me to my next slide as well, is responding to alerts and incidents is extremely important. This is an example of a customer's environment, which is pretty noisy. It's a pretty big environment. But by default, Microsoft will spam you with alerts and incidents. Some are good, some are not so good. I'm not going to deny that. But there can be lots of value in there if you treat them correctly. So you need to be aware of looking into what is in there, what are the possibilities, what are the incidents we see, and now how to mitigate them. So don't stop securing your environments after you have implemented these security controls. After the implementation, it only starts there. You should be constantly monitoring the environment for anomalies, for weird things happening. It could be an attack from the outside or an insider threat, but it's so important to look into the alerts and incidents and see what's happening. There are lots of things default here, lots is configured. If you want to go more into details, you can always look into Microsoft Sentinel as a team or Splunk and create your own rules there. For example, you could have certain high privileged teams like the management team, which you might want to monitor extra. If somebody is added there, you might want to receive an email that somebody was added to the management team, just so you know what's happening, just so you're aware of what's happening within the environment. So we saw a ton of information right now. I know it's a lot to digest and a lot of things to look into. What I want to do now as the finishing of the presentation is looking into, okay, if you have something, a high value team, what are some of the steps you should be recommending to implement? So this will take some things from the entire presentation and pick into what you should be doing. And this is it. So if you have a high value team, let's say management team or a project team, confidential, legal team, HR, what are these steps you need to be doing? First of all, I showed you the labels which you can assign to groups, which can limit what access can be given to guests, but also through conditional access, limiting if personal access is enabled on personal devices. It is extremely powerful, and it's a really awesome feature which I do recommend you looking into and using. It can be pretty cumbersome at first because sometimes, to be honest, it doesn't work all that good. Sometimes you have to know where the limitations are, but once you identify the limitations, it is a really awesome product to use. It's a nice feature, and end users will not be impacted by it a lot. Besides that, everybody's saying it, but identity is key. Requiring MFA, blocking legacy authentication, making sure that MFA is configured correctly and from a secure place. It is extremely important to look into. So just be aware that identity is where it happens. You should be looking into identities, who is logging in, what are they doing, and how can you mitigate that. I also saw a question in chat just a little bit ago about passwordless. So passwordless aims to remove passwords from an organization and allow you to log in, for example, through a FIDO2 key. I have one right here. So this is just a key I have enabled. It connects through Bluetooth. And if I connect that account and this key to my computer, I can log into my account with a fingerprint sensor. So this is a great way of authenticating. It removes the password, so password cannot be leaked, of course, that's great. And if I lose this, people will not be able to do anything with it because they need my finger. Well, if they cut off my finger, good luck, you're in. But it is a great mitigation. It's also important to know that FIDO2, which is what the category of these keys are, the protocol used, is not phishable. There are some products out there, NGIX, I think it is, which allows you to phish for example, a valid MFA claim and steal that token, try to let the user approve a malicious MFA prompt to have access to the environment. FIDO2 and passwordless will mitigate that. Third point, auditing, monitoring, responding to alerts. It's so important, and I don't see it happening enough. I know we all have too little time. We're so busy in IT, and security never stops. But it is so important to monitor the environment, look for specific events, respond to the alerts, create your alerts yourself, create automation, look into building a SOC or having a third party do that, because monitoring is key. Auditing needs to happen. And then besides, the last point is specific to teams. It's a team-specific configuration, but if you're going to be having high-value teams, be aware of what applications, what connectors, what tabs they can add, and what impact that has. Again, it's twofold. It's one, to protect from insider threat. If somebody adds a malicious application to teams and tries to upload all of the data in there, that's insider threat. But if it's a malicious application, if it steals the data from teams, it steals the token, or it's breached, third-party breach, a supply chain attack, this can have a big impact. So knowing, certainly for the high-value teams, what applications are out there and what the mitigation steps are is extremely important. So I know it's a lot of information in this presentation. I'm coming to the end right now. What I want to give away is it's important that you need to be aware of the multiple aspects within teams, within security. You should be aware of what's happening inside of your environment, and it doesn't stop. And don't have iLabs enabled. Don't look into only teams, but look beyond, because there's so much coming out there. And of course, security never stops. We never sleep. We always work, because there's always attacks happening. So be aware of what's happening, try to mitigate it, and protect your organization as well as possible. Thank you.